Hey, welcome everyone to another episode of Proudly Made in Africa. And today's guest, who we're expecting in any minute now, is Conall O'Caoimh. And he is an established artist. He is a sculptor and he has developed some beautiful artwork in Ireland. So as we explore trade justice, sustainable business practices, and decolonization on this podcast, I couldn't think of anyone better that could, lend their insight to us rather than Conall. So he has a decade-long work in ethical trade, community-centered initiatives, and a deep understanding of the challenges potential with African economies. So today I'm looking forward to exploring his views on themes like decolonizing trade, empowering local entrepreneurs, and the role of fair business practices across industries. So I believe his experience can offer a fresh lens to our listeners, and especially on how we can thrive towards a more equitable, interconnected world. Okay, he's here. Hello.
Hello, how are you?
Doing great, Conall. How are you doing?
Good to see you.
Thank you. 1 second, I was just gonna say that I've been, going through some of your sculptures online, and that is so beautiful. I can't wait to get into some of them.
Well, my life has changed a lot since 7
Oh.
years ago when I was doing that other work. So
wow.
obviously I'm in a very different kind of work now, and enjoying the freedom, and so that has allowed me to be creative in a very different way. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, guys, welcome to another episode of Proudly Made in Africa. And today we're here with none other than their advocate, Conall O'Caoimh. And it's such an honor to have you here today with us, sir. I can't wait to really get into some of these topics, because more than anyone, I've really been interested in finding out your insights that you can lend to us on these topics, as they are far and wide, but yet so intricate and close to us. So if you don't mind me saying, how can you just encapsulate the variety of work that you've been, the opportunities that you've had to, expand your perspectives on the current project that you've had? If you were to bring that down into some sentences for us, how would that be?
Sure, we'll do. Happy to. So answering your question, going right back to my story and how I, started in this. Yeah. I should also add, it's 7 years since I stepped out from PMIA. Okay. So my data is 7 years behind. My case studies are 7 years behind. And I know that. And I know that 7 years is a really long time in African development, especially in recent African development. Things are happening so fast, fabulously happening so fast. Well, some bad things are also happening very fast, but the good things are really moving fast. And therefore, I know when I speak that I'm out of date in those regards. And yet all I can say is the stuff that I've kind of learned as I've gone. Yeah. So first of all, I guess I had lived in Latin America. I was always interested in justice, and it was justice that had brought me to Latin America to learn around the land struggle for people in Latin America, the wages struggle, the debt struggle, and there was a parallel struggle to a lot of what we hear in Africa as well. And so I went and I spent a few years living in Brazil, and I came home from there back to Ireland, and I decided to do a master's in development studies, and economics and politics were my initial background. And then I said I'd do a master's in development because I had a lot of opinions, and I thought, actually, I want structure and science on my opinions, and to be able to marshal them and make sure that my thinking was straight and not just hunches or prejudices or whatever. And so I went and I did a master's in development in UCD, and actually in the kind of close to where the PMI fellowship is now operating. And so then as part of that, I went to Mozambique, And in Mozambique, my thesis was about fisheries in Mozambique and how the World Trade Organization, because it was new at that stage, the World Trade Organization. I certainly want to learn about it and learn how it works and how it operates. And so I took it on as the focus for my thesis. And went to Mozambique to look at how the World Trade Organization would affect it. And while I was there, I could see actually, yes, the trade rules weren't great for Mozambique, but actually the IMF was pushing a frightful policy in Mozambique. And it was around the cashew nut. And cashew nuts were been grown by most farmers in Mozambique had a cashew tree. And the cashew tree was a cash crop for farmers. So it was so important that after they'd had 25 years of war, and when that settled in the first census after the war, one of the questions that was in the census to know how rich or how poor people were was to ask, do you have a cashew tree? And if you had a cashew tree, it meant you had a certain level of income. Yeah.
Okay.
And so it was that central, but also really unusual in Africa of the 1970s and 80s and 90s. There were factories in Mozambique that processed the cashew nut.
Yeah.
And it's a laborious process and it takes a lot of work. But the cashew nut was been processed in Mozambique. But it was leaving the country in sacks of 50 kilos. Now, when you want some cashews with a pint of beer, you go up to the bar and you'll get them in 50 grams packet. And I thought, the work has been done, it's ready, and yet it's going off out of Africa, out of Mozambique, and somewhere in Europe, somebody is putting them into the small little packet and making all the money.
Wow.
And so the cashew nut became for me this idea that we had to have value added in Africa. And the idea occurred to me in 1995 when I was there, 96, I think, the summer of 96, I was in Mozambique for research for my thesis. And that is 1996, I should say. It wasn't 1896.
Wow.
And so it was clear to me that you had to get the value addition happening in country for poverty to be reduced. Yeah. And the IMF at the time was actually forcing, as a condition for the loans that Mozambique desperately needed, was forcing that they would change it and that they would allow the nuts to be exported rather than to be processed locally. So Mozambique was going to be thrown right back, de-industrialized, and pushed right back into being a commodity society rather than any bit of development that it had. Oh. And I came home and I was involved in the lobbying around getting that rule and exposing what the IMF was doing in that case, and had some little bit of impact on that. And I came home and I got a job working on advocacy and trade rules and debt cancellation. So the Jubilee campaign, which you might have heard of, and going to the World Trade Organization. So I was in Doha for the Doha meeting. I was in Cancun for the Cancun. I was in Hong Kong for the Hong Kong ministerials of the WTO, involved in the trade rules. But all the time while I was doing that, the cashew nut remained in my head. Wow. About remember the cashew nut. And it never went away from me. As long as, Africa is sending, you might be decolonized, but as long as you're sending your raw materials off to Europe for Europe and America to get rich processing them, it's still colonial economics.
Yes.
And so that's what I thought you need to break, is the economic model. And of course, where that came for me as an Irish person, until I was a boy, Ireland was still sending, we're rich in cows. We have the grass, we have the rain for cows. And cows is what farmers have done for years and years in Ireland. But our cows, our market was in Britain mostly. Wow. And our traditional market. but our cows would be walked onto the boat. And so farmers would bring their cows to Dublin and they would go onto a boat. Or dealers would buy the cows from the farmers in the rural areas and bring them to city, and they would go walk onto a boat, and at the other side in Britain, they would walk off the boat and be driven to a factory where they would be processed and turned into meat.
Wow.
And so the same way that African countries are exporting their raw materials,
Yes.
we were exporting our cattle. And in a British factory, they would get chopped and packaged and turned into the nice product that you see in the supermarkets, and people would pay a whole lot more for it. And there were factory jobs happening in England for it. There were businesses making wealth in England for it. The packaging jobs were happening in England, the transport jobs, etc. And when I was a boy, it had just happened before. So I'm 60, born in 1962, which makes me 62 now. And right at that time, when I was 10 and 11 and 12, I was hearing my uncles, who were farmers, talking about that for the first time, there were factories here that would process and send the beef to England instead of sending the cow to England. And there was a couple of factories, but one in particular that later got into huge, big scandals.
Yeah.
But the guy who did it was the first to crack getting the health and safety standards right, the veterinary standards right, the timing right, the price right, the logistics cool, the packaging well presented and fulfilling all the securities and the safety certifications that they needed.
Wow.
And doing it at scale. And he was the first one to do that and to crack and to get contracts for regular sale of Irish beef into English markets. And so jobs started to happen here, factory jobs and processing and transport jobs and logistics and the refrigeration and veterinary services and all those other things started to happen around it. And farmers also did better, because farmers could then say, will I sell my beef to the factory or will I sell my beef to the boat? And because they had a choice of the two, they could negotiate price.
Okay.
And so farm incomes went up with that. Okay. There were city factory jobs, but there were also farm level income rose as well. And so it became, when I was at school, that's what the teachers spoke about. It's what my uncles spoke about, who were farmers, was how this transformation was happening. So when I arrived in Mozambique and I saw the cashew nut, I immediately thought of the Irish cow. And the two were completely connected for me in terms of how one was creating a transformation for us, and the other was obviously the transformation that African countries needed to achieve in their economy. Yeah. Obviously, there were other changes; they can work those out themselves. But this economic change seemed to me that we still have the economics of colonialism, and there's an obligation on us to break out from that. Yeah.
When you speak about the similarities within the farmers in Ireland, which is very clear to me, and you're very spot on with that. I'm curious, at that period when the exportation was heavily dependent on English market, the Irish citizens were still in need of meat. So why wasn't it the case that, or what happened that it wasn't a priority, selling to the citizens of Ireland rather than depending on the English markets when there was a factory here in Ireland?
It's the exact same as in any developing country, as in any African country.
Yeah.
There's good product being produced and exported, but the local people, they can consume some of it, but they don't have the income to be consuming more of it. So my granny would have liked to be putting more beef on the dinner table, but she didn't have the money for it. She put some beef on the table, but not enough for us to be consuming. But also, we kind of specialize in cows. We've more cows than people. Yeah. at some stage, I think we've about doubled the number. I can check the stats, but we're about 2 cows, or I don't know, I'll Google it. But we've got a significant number more cows than people, and so therefore we've specialized in it. We don't make any cars, we don't make any aeroplanes, we don't make any clothes. I grew up with this example that I was hearing from my uncles, hearing from my teachers at school, that Ireland used to lose the value, but that we had just started to have factories that would process it. And that did better. There were factory jobs, there were veterinary jobs, there were packaging and transport and logistics, certification and all those other services around it. But also farm prices went up, because the farmer now, instead of being trapped by the middlemen, the dealers who bought from the countryside and brought them into the factories, the farmers could actually choose, would they sell to the dealer who brought it to the Irish factory, or would they sell to the dealer who took it to the boat? And they had the choice between the two, and therefore their prices went up. So that was, knowing that example was why when I arrived in Mozambique, I noticed the cashew nut, because I could see that here they had factories, and the IMF policy was effectively closing down their factories, and deindustrialization was taking place. Whereas if there's to be any chance for people to earn their own livelihood, there needs to be industrialization and adding of value to their products for them to reduce poverty. Yeah.
Yes, and that's very devastating. And we're actually glad that you're able to do some work in the direction of bringing that to light. I'm just curious, do you feel there are children of such policies still affecting the African, global trade contribution?
Of course there are. The old policies haven't gone away. Yeah. The old market dominance hasn't gone away. You can make a fabulous chocolate in Africa, but the European and the northern markets are already captured by the ones who had the advantage during colonialism.
Yeah.
The names Cadbury and Rowntree, they dominate today because they were given the colonial advantage during the colony of previous years. Yeah.
Yes. So what do you see as your own vision? If you're to say, I envision an Africa tomorrow that has so and so, how do you see?
I'll go back a moment if I can, just to I came home from Mozambique having seen that example of the cashew nut, and having had the idea, and I even had the words value added in Africa, about which it remained in my head. I got a job doing work in relation to the World Trade Organization, in relation to the IMF, advocacy and lobbying, trying to make the trade rules fairer, trying to get debt cancellation. And so I was doing that for 15 years. And during that 15 years, the cashew nut was staying at the back of my head. And I was also watching the data of Ireland's trade, because the EU website actually makes the trading data very public. You can access it very, very easily. And I was tracking each year. There were 6 countries in Africa that Ireland had a special aid relationship with. And they were all least developed countries. So we were proud that our country had chosen Mozambique and Lesotho and Zambia and Uganda and Ethiopia. I don't think I missed one, but countries who were, did I say Zambia? But countries who were, where poverty was the criteria in Ireland selecting it. We weren't choosing countries where our companies could get advantage. We were choosing, at that point. Some of that has changed since. But so I was collecting the data each year on, we're giving so much in aid, but how much business are we doing? And what are we purchasing? So we started to collect the data, and we saw that while the aid was at this level, the trade was down at this level, and it was almost nothing.
Wow.
So we were talking about, we were having a relationship with countries that was going to be a mature and equal relationship. And yet after 40 years of trade with Lesotho, which was our first country that we had aid relationships with, after 40 years, we were still buying nothing from them.
Wow.
Yeah, except occasionally a little bit of raw material. We weren't, so our relationship of aid was not maturing into an equal relationship of two parties who work with each other. So that became an extra impetus for me. And so I said, look, I'm doing all this work. I was 15 years working on the trade rules. We really only would make an impact at the very periphery on the small pieces around it. But I thought, okay, it's time to actually do something about the cashew nut. And so I spoke to a few friends and a few people, and don't go first to your friends if you're starting something. Go to people who you know are committed, and not to you, but to the idea. And so one friend introduced me to her husband, and then through work I met another woman, and we brought the three of us came together, and the three of us were the co-founders of, initially we called it Value Added in Africa, and then later we changed its name to Proudly Made in Africa. Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, because it was an easier idea to communicate to people. But it was founded on the cashew nut, informed by the Irish cow. Yeah, was the inspiration for starting the organization. And after that other 15 years, I had more experience to know how to run an organization, how to get the confidence of funders to help us get it started, the network of people, a better understanding of the trade rules that we were going to have to work inside, etc. So we went, and first myself and the other one, Michelle Hardiman, who was the other co-founder, and Matthew Murphy, who's now a professor in Canada in the University of Victoria. The three of us. And so Michelle and I traveled to Liberia. I was going there as a consultancy for another aid agency. And while I was there, they allowed a certain amount of my time would be used to search and to see what products could we find. Liberia was very recently out of war, and the reality was there wasn't anything there where the production was ready for selling to European markets. So then Matt Murphy came with me on the following trip, and we went 2 trips to Ghana, where we looked and we traveled around factories to see who was making what. And Ghana had actually a very well-developed furniture sector, making outdoor garden furniture, which was one area. It had a number of garment factories, and also it had food processing. And what we saw was that if your objective is to reduce poverty, and not just for a few people, but for broadly, if the products you work with are products that are based on local agriculture, then when the factory sells more, the farmers sell more, as well as the farmer jobs. So remembering the Irish farmer and how their incomes came up together with the other. So that's why, as a poverty reduction measure, finding factories who are using local raw materials was going to be central to having. We could export trade. We found, for example, in Lesotho, that Philips had a factory making bulbs. Now, if we get Philips Lesotho bulbs selling into European market, yeah, good. It's it's better than not. But actually, most of the inputs, most of the parts of those bulbs were being brought from abroad. They weren't been made in Lesotho. And so if you find instead somebody who's making a food product based on raw materials grown by thousands and thousands of farmers, you're not only helping the factory people, you're also helping the farmers. And that was an important part in our model. Yeah.
That is crazy, because so when you speak about aid being given from the likes of Ireland, which isn't just the only country that gives aid to African businesses, right? I'm just trying to understand are there no supervision or strategies in terms of what these aids should be used for, maybe helping expand the production sites and things like that? Or are those aids just to help them survive, just like it's handouts kind of things? What do you think was missing in the production or the supply of these aids?
Yeah. In most of the countries where Ireland was giving aid, and I should preface this by Ireland's aid program was far more developmental than many other countries. Some countries gave aid, a lot of aid, so as to keep one of their cronies in power in their country. It did not have a developmental function. Others gave aid so that, for example, I know one country that builds ships, so it would help the fisheries sector in Mozambique. Denmark would help the fisheries sector in Mozambique, but they had to buy Danish fishing vessels, and they had to buy Danish fishing nets, and they had to, so because Denmark has a factory, a supply chain developed for the fisheries industry. So actually, by giving the money to Mozambique, it was useful to Mozambique, but actually it was really useful to Denmark as well.
Yes.
And Ireland didn't do that. That was tied aid. Italy would give tractors, but you had to buy an Italian tractor. So Ireland was not tied. You could use the money in your way. But the sectors that we chose were developmental sectors of education and health, which were needed. So that's not just handouts. So there was a rationale to that, not looking at how the whole economy operates.
Yes.
So it was narrowly on the idea, well, if you educate people and keep them healthy, business will follow, but actually not by itself it won't. You also need to actually look at the productive processes in those countries and the value chains and what's happening in those value chains. And they were still happening in a colonial manner, that countries were producing cocoa that would still go to Europe. You might get your fair trade premium of a small advantage, but actually the raw material still went to a European factory to be turned into chocolate. And the jobs were happening in Europe, the value addition was happening, and the profit was happening in Europe.
It still seems like till today, it's still a major threat, because according to global trade statistics, the whole of Africa's contribution to the global trade market is around 2%. And this is basically because you are still dealing with commodities in their raw forms, so no processing. And I remember reading the vice president of the World Bank actually just complaining that Africa needs to find a way to step up. But when we think about the colonial, like, deep roots within the economies, how do you see Africa really, infusing themselves or taking back control, just the way Ireland has done something similar in terms of the value chains?
It is happening. Like in each country, I've been to, I don't know, maybe about a dozen different African countries. And in each country, there are people who are, they're in the margin, they're still small mostly, but who are taking the local produce and who are creating a high value product. So, for example, in Mozambique, in Madagascar, the chocolate that MIA, Made in Africa, MIA chocolate, it's a really high quality product. Start to finish, even the packaging is printed in Madagascar, and it's coming to European and international markets as a really high value product. That's transformational, not only for that factory and the farmers connected to it, but also that factory becomes a signal for other entrepreneurs in that country. So, and it was the case in Ireland that when the beef factory was able to work, then other people said, well, if that guy can sell beef to British supermarkets, I can sell jam. And somebody else was, I can sell garments, and somebody else was, I can make bicycles. And so an economy begins to, so you need to see those champions who have cracked it and let others see their success so that they will multiply and do from that and disseminate the learning from that, which is part of what your podcast series does. spread that knowledge to others so that they will follow. And one, like, it was really challenging. I don't want to say this was easy, but one of the things we used to, we had a number of products from Kenya coming into the European market, and we used to bring together in Nairobi a number of the local business people who had factories, middle and small, some of them very small, but some of them actually were quite significant and processing for Kenya and selling into Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, some of the neighboring countries. And so tea bags, jams, kind of local produce that was sold into sweets, crisps, various products sold into neighboring countries. And we used to bring them together and have a sharing workshops between them, and get a few of them would take the stage and talk about their businesses and how they are achieving. And one was a woman who was a small, strong woman, and she was talking about it. And we had helped her to sell some product into both Ireland and Britain. But she also, before us, she was already selling from a community group in Meru. They were already, which is a region in central Kenya. They were selling into Italy and into Japan before we came to them. We helped out on the England and Ireland. And she gave, in this talk in Strathmore University in Nairobi, she gave a presentation about their products and about their health and safety certification and the how they go to market.
Okay.
And she took photographs with her product on the market shelves in the supermarkets in those countries. And she said, oh yeah, and now we sell each year 13 containers of product we sell into those markets. And from the back of the room, one of the big businessmen who was running a big factory, maybe with 200 employees, but who was also selling within Africa.
Yeah.
He corrected her from the back of the room. He said, you mean 13 pallets?
Wow.
And she said, no, 13 containers. And this little struggle, she became taller. And after the meeting, the other business people there gathered around her, asking her questions. How did you get your safety certification, your food safety certs? How did you solve this problem? How did you solve that? What about currency? And how long do they wait before they pay you? And they all had these really practical business questions to ask her. And the man had tried to put her down and say, no, it's only, and she had actually, yes, it's 13 containers.
Yes.
This man with 300 employees, he wasn't selling any containers outside of East Africa. Yeah. so
but still, they have
to
no, that's amazing. But I still feel like one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of exportation from Africa is because of the challenges within the logistics chain, right? So, like, do you see any progress in that direction? Because I was speaking to the CEO of Gorilla Coffee in Uganda as well, who is trying to build the culture of domestic consumption, but it's not a culture of coffee consumption in Uganda compared to Europe. And the European warehouse or supply chain managers are using that as an advantage, to lower the prices because they have control of his demand, basically. So I'm always curious, do you feel the responsibility lies solely on the businesses, such as that woman who had to go above and beyond to crack the code, and now maybe she will help empower her potential competitors? Or is it something that lies on the hand of the government to really help? Like, let's say the African government should really help infuse those helps, partner with aids and the likes.
Absolutely. And there are, like, first of all, there's a number all the stakeholders have responsibilities, and all the stakeholders have opportunities, so it's both opportunity and responsibility. And it is, the local factories have to do something. They have to get up and develop their product and improve their product to the standards. They have to, you know, they have to pay their employees well and properly and honorably. They have to pay their taxes so that the government can build the roads, so that the government can have ports that work, and that isn't somebody trying to see what can I get into my pocket, because if they don't have a proper wage, they're likely to. But so you know, they need to have good observation of what's happening so that the corruption doesn't happen. But please take that out. I don't want to be even mentioning that word in my conversation.
It's the reality of the situation.
It's not my part to even venture into that terrain. So I'm very happy if you would take that out when you're editing from the previous stage. It's no Europeans' business to do that. Africans can solve that for themselves.
But they are not. That's the saddest part about it, though.
Yeah. But I don't want to be taking on that voice. That's not my part. There are much more important things that I might say that would be a bit different from what some other white faces might say.
Okay, so off the camera, quickly, what would you advise someone such as an African like me to really talk about in that direction? Because this is still a very heavy problem that we are running out of options to solve.
Well, I was delighted that you talked to Gorilla Coffee, because Gorilla are now a good number of years making a high quality product. They have food safety certification. They have had some tastes of international market. I don't know how much they have at the moment, but so they have looked at it. And because Gorilla is doing that, there are other people doing other products in Uganda who see Gorilla and they say, hey, if Gorilla can do that, I'm going to give it a shot. You know, he wasn't that clever at school. When we saw him at school, if he was able to do it, I should be able to do it. You know,
just inspiring others.
Yeah, and so that's the confidence that people, if they see one of their own people has cracked it, then they'll start. So that's at the entrepreneurial level. Entrepreneurs need to see the success of each other. So a podcast like yours, it's really good that you talk to Gorilla and let others see that case study. You know, Meru is another case study of who's cracked international markets. Yeah, the Mia chocolate from Mozambique. It is. Now there are examples that I was familiar with 7 years ago. I presume there's a whole lot of other ones. Like even I was looking in the New York Times the other day, and ads came up for Vivo Barefoot, which are made in, where exactly are they made? But it's in Botswana, I think they're made. Shoes. Okay. And so, but I was looking at the New York Times, and up comes ads for shoes made in Botswana. That's pretty good, you know.
Yeah,
they're in on that stage. Yeah.
Yes.
I may be wrong on Botswana. I just have to check where they were. But that was only 2-3 days ago. That advert came up for me on the New York Times. So actually, some of them are cracking in at that level and doing it well. Yeah.
That's interesting. So at least it's good to see that there are certain success stories. And yeah, I think I've seen it much more prevalent in the service industry, where, you know, skills, expertise, creativity is cracking the international stage much more faster. But it sheds a light on those societies as well. So it's also good for people.
Absolutely. And like Nairobi is probably one of the places that I would know best in East Africa. And there's a very thriving tech community there.
Yes.
Yeah. And indeed, Proudly Made in Africa worked together with a Nairobi company to develop an app that would help producers calculate the value chain from their product through to the market, and to see the value that each person gets and how much might their product be competitive on the international market. And we developed that as an app, and the Nairobi company that we were working with won an award for the app. Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, actually, when I spent some time in Nairobi, that was the first time I also encountered what's it called, M-Pesa. So the M-Pesa application, it's amazing, and those are like just quick examples, like you mentioned.
And M-Pesa, the mobile money, was active and was a very large proportion of the Kenyan economy long before we had mobile money in Europe. Like certainly 6-8 years before we had it in Europe, it was already functioning right across the economy. And it became a real transformation element in those economies, where, because like even one day I was in a queue at a shop to get mobile credit, and the guy beside me, he had sold something, I don't know what, he had earned some money, and he was putting it onto his phone, and he said, I got to get on the phone, otherwise I'll just drink it. So the phone was becoming his way of saving. It was his bank account, you know. So it wasn't only, you know, but also the, you know, in a few places I saw that in small towns, women who were selling product, who used to have to come and pay a bus and come on a lorry once a week or once a month down to the big city to sell their product and hang around. At the end of the day, the product is going for a lower price. So they still have their product at the end of the day. So they sell it at a lower price to get rid of it. And then they pay their lorry to go back up home to their hometown again. They spent a full day, they've paid bus fare, and they sold at a cheaper price.
Wow.
Instead, with a mobile phone, the woman with the produce, she rings, texts the hotel, they say which day they want the product. She puts it on the lorry. She doesn't have to go down herself. They collect it from the lorry. They text the money back up to her. She saved herself her fare of traveling. She saved herself a day. She's selling to her preferred customer, and she's selling at her agreed price. In all those ways, her value chain is far more profitable as a result of that. Yeah.
Well, do you feel like the current situation with the international regulations, because I know that it's either going towards more of a fairer state or more of an exploitative state? So even though we have entrepreneurs who would leave the international, you know, economies now, I'm talking about Africans who are in diaspora, who would look to go home and start something, until they get to a certain income level, revenue level, then they will start to realize there are certain limitations, restrictions on the global stage that will prevent them from really cracking some resistance. So do you feel like what would be the few things that you think need to change? Not necessarily, you know, from the individualistic point of view, but from that global trade point of view, what do you think needs to change to really make Africa, you know, switch the narrative?
Well, one of the things that happened in Ireland's case, and I don't know automatically, but I have a hunch, because for 100 years, we had people going to America. For 150 years, a large volume of people going to America.
Yeah.
And in the last 50 years, they have been crucial in bringing American companies to Ireland and developing jobs in Ireland and transforming the economy in Ireland. Yeah. So I think actually the strong diaspora will become a real benefit. It may not be in the life of the first person who goes and who is surviving when they arrive and struggling to establish themselves in the country. But by the time their children and their grandchildren are doing it, I think in 50 years' time, you're going to see that the children of the diaspora are a real force in bringing industrialization and development into African countries. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think there's a very good thing to happen in the future. And I'm saying that on the basis of what we saw in Ireland, that the diaspora opened the door for well, first of all, when their companies wanted somewhere to expand, they had a relationship with and an identity with Ireland that gave them the courage and the confidence that why go to Italy, they may as well come here because they had a relationship with it. And then also for Irish companies, that they also opened the door into the American market for Irish companies. So, so I think in the longer term, but that's a very long process, and it's hard to tell children living in a shanty town that they have to wait for that to happen. So, you know, so don't wait for it to happen. People are doing a lot of pieces. People like the Sally, the woman who I referred to, are doing that already and creating that change. Yeah.
Also, in the case of Ireland, I'm pretty sure, you know, the companies that came from America found it very pleasant based on the conducive environment that the government created for them. Do you feel there's a lot of difference between the government of Ireland and the governments in African countries?
Well, the country I grew up in is very different from the country that is now.
Hmm.
Yeah. Like I am 60, but I'm only 60.
Hmm.
But we used to vote tribally. And in some ways we still vote tribally. We would never use the phrase because we think it's only Africa that acts tribally.
Hmm.
But yes, those politicians in the 70s and 80s and before that in the 60s and the 50s had a tribal affiliation, a following that was based on what happened in our struggle for independence 100 years ago. And that pattern determined, and people voted, and it didn't matter what policies. And we had some frightfully corrupt leaders who feathered their own nest. One told us, we must all tighten our belts. And meanwhile, he was getting kickbacks from banks.
Wow.
While he did a speech to the public saying that they were cutting the health services. And he said, we must all tighten our belts. And yet later on, we found out that he was getting regular payments from banks and that a number of providers were cancelling his bills.
Wow.
So we've had that here. We've had the vast majority of people vote on a tribal allegiance, not on the rationale of the policies.
Okay.
So that's.
But what changed?
Yeah.
How did it evolve?
I can remember as when the first motorways. We didn't have motorways here when I was a kid.
Yeah.
The motorways only came in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And we, so many things we didn't. If we wanted to, like, I was in my mid-20s when I first flew. Flight was way too expensive. We would get the boat to England and the train to go to France. We'd get the train down through to France. Maybe environmentally we'll have to go back to doing that. but the trains are so much better now than they were then, and they're far more comfortable,
That's true.
So the boat is faster, all those elements of it. Yeah. We're Ireland is only a recently developed country, very recently.
Do you feel Ireland's participation in the EU is what helped them, or something changed within the accountability of governments? Because the governments might still have their own interests, but they are producing certain results, at least in the most recent years, like you've pointed out. So what do you think really has been the catalyst that's at least helped the people? Was it the people making them accountable?
Oh, I think it was a number of things. There was absolutely membership of the European Union. It didn't only give us access to markets, it also required levels of accountability and rational policy, so that we couldn't give favors to our preferred companies and to the guy who was giving an envelope to the tendering had to be transparent. Yeah. Those kind of elements, and bodies were put in place to oversee, to ensure that it's going to be transparent, and to be able to, that the one who didn't get the contract can complain to those bodies and say the process wasn't fair. And so to get all those things in place, and it wasn't the government minister who was going to make the judgment of was it fair or not. So the European Union didn't only open up markets to us, it also gave us a model for administration that we would never have arrived at ourselves. It also gave us gender equality. It enforced gender equality. When my wife, her mother was a school teacher. When she got married, she had to stop being a school teacher.
Wow.
Because there were only so many jobs in the economy, and the patriarchal state that we were at the time said, well, women should stay at home and let their husbands go to work. So her mother had to stop being a school teacher, and it was only when we joined the European Union in 1973 that rule was changed, and she was able to go back to being a school teacher. So gender changed, and women's role and in society, their participation at each level in society, but including in the economy. But particularly in public discourse, made a huge difference. Before it was men who did it all, and men who screwed it up. The arrival of American companies was a huge piece, that workers got to be accountable in their workplace. They got to see models of production, of a rationale for how things are structured and processes. It's engineering that has come into government. Engineering has come into manufacturing, and that has changed. And so, when you had an Irish boss, you could make an excuse. When you had an American boss, if you weren't there on Monday, you didn't get paid. And if you weren't there on Tuesday, you mightn't have any job on Wednesday.
Yes, that was actually a very good answer that you shared with media. Thank you for that. I think a lot of people will find that one very interesting as well. I think my final question here is just a tradition that we're setting up with Proudly Made in Africa, which is our guest tells us their most ideal vision for Africa, the future Africa. So it's just for you to complete the statement of, my vision of Africa, I imagine that, and then you complete it.
Yeah, I imagine an Africa where families have livelihoods based on, capturing the value of their own work, so that when they work, it's not somebody else who's getting rich, but that they capture the value in it. And so I look around at where is that happening. And initially I thought, okay, we'll get the manufacturing going, and that's good, it's important, but there are other stages as well. And there was a group in Ghana who very cleverly developed a model that the farmers own the brand, and their cocoa goes to a factory in Germany that processes it into a finished product, and it markets it in Europe as divine chocolate. But the farmers own 42% of the brand Divine. There's an NGO owns 42%, and there's a bank owns 16%. And so they created this model. They didn't have the factory nearby yet and the conditions to start a factory. So instead, they capture the marketing value. The manufacturing value still happens in Germany, but the marketing value they're capturing and profit is coming back to them. Yeah. Another one, I met this organization called Light Years IP for intellectual property, and they ran a really successful campaign. No, actually, Oxfam ran the campaign.
Okay.
Light Years IP did the legal work with coffee.
Okay.
So coffee first grew in Ethiopia, and there were 3 geographical regions that were the Kaffa, Yirgacheffe, and the third one is escaping me, Sidamo. And Starbucks went to was going to register as a trademark Kaffa, Sidamo, Yirgacheffe. And Oxfam and Light Years IP ran the campaign to say, stop Oxfam from doing that. That intellectual property belongs to the people of those regions who across thousands of years have cultivated the coffee beans that are the original coffee, Arabica coffee beans. And Light Years IP did the legal work. They didn't do a campaign. They didn't go out and educate farmers. They did the legal work that registered the intellectual property of those 3 names in the ownership of the farmers of those regions. And as a result, and I met the leader of Light Years IP, and he is my source, that he told me that the farm gate price of those coffees in those regions went up because and by a very significant amount, because those farmers, their Kaffa, Yirgacheffe, Sidamo, now had the same intellectual property coverage that Champagne has, that Marmaham has. So they got it registered as a denomination of origin. So you can't, if you produce a wine and you try to sell it as Champagne, the law will come after you. But now also, if you try to sell a coffee and call it Kafa or Yurgachev or Sidamo, the law will come after you. Yeah. And they did that, and farm incomes went up. So without any extension workers, without running campaigns of education and courses for changing what farmers do, just by the stroke of the pen, the farm income came up, and Starbucks lost a little bit.
Wow, that is beautiful. But I wonder why we don't have more of that happening, because there's a lot more opportunities for that to happen.
Well, my learning, because I started into the manufacturing, but my learning was the value chain has intellectual property, it has marketing, and needing to capture value at those levels of the value chain as well are all necessary to bring about change. And you can't underestimate the role that local markets make in the development of the local market, so that so that there's companies kind of get on their feet and get scale and get the skills and get the standards to be able to compete internationally. But thankfully, more and more are doing it. Yeah,
that's true. Well, thank you so much for lending your insights and just your experience and stories. It has been such an honor, sir, and I'm hoping we get another opportunity to do something like this again.
Good.
Thank you so much once again. God bless you.
Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Guys, that was one episode with Conall O'Caoimh, and he is the founder of Proudly Made in Africa. That was such an exciting episode. But one thing that really stood out for me was the passion he had in really reminding himself, regardless of how far he had gone into other ventures, of how much he needed to come back to that cashew initiative that, he had seen the pain point and he knew intrinsically that there was something that he could do about it. That ultimately led to Proudly Made in Africa, as he stated in that episode. So for me, what I really take from that also is the fact that it takes a village, first of all, because the individual contributions automatically inspires the good and the hard work in others. Like he said, there's always going to be corruption. Well, we say it like that, but it doesn't mean you should give up hope. It just means fight the battles that you know you can handle, which means if you have it in you to take on the challenge of starting something, inspiring or helping someone around you to really break through certain resistance, then by all means, because the change that you inspire today and spark would also have a ripple effect that automatically would start to diminish the power given to certain government or corruption levels around us. Thirdly, I understand that the government structure and administration structure within Ireland, for example, it had a similar, a nature to what's happening in Africa. But one of the most important crystal is the membership of Ireland within EU. Now, I do know that we have some large government bodies in Africa, like ECOWAS and so on. But the problem is how efficient are they? How much integrity is there in these situations? We need to start to understand that we as a people need that visibility. We need to see the proof of accountability in these situations and these organizations. For example, he spoke about aid. Now, aid is given to a country or an industry for 40 years. 40 years. And the aid metrics is this high, but the trade metrics is this low. Now, this is what you don't understand. An organization or a country can give aids in the billions, but they don't mention that the trade. So the country you're giving aids to is giving their real values back at maybe a fraction, right? But the value that is gained from that resources that is sent is double or triple the aid being provided. So automatically they are gaining, and they're also gaining from the fact where they look like the good people providing such aids. You understand? So you're giving aids and you have this angelic view from people that, oh, you're helping, so and so economies and so on. But if this aid isn't going into any actual growth metric or strategy, is it really aids? Well, some might argue yes, no, depending. I'm only asking the questions for both sides of the table. That, as I said, was one really insightful episode. You guys should stay tuned for more. Thank you so much for tuning in. Looking forward to putting out more episodes for you guys. Thank you. Take care and have a lovely day.